Hey everyone, welcome to the podcast Too Much Disinformation, the pod that uncovers the good, the bad, and the fake of the online world. I'm your host, Rafi Mendelsohn, and on today's pod, are going to be discussing the emergence of new and alternative social media sites. It's something that we see a lot of news headlines, a lot of information around, a lot of discussion around, but we're going to unpack what that is, who they are, what role that they play. And on today's pod, we're going to be leading us through this conversation is Dr. Welton Chang. He is the co-founder and CEO of Pyrra Technologies, where they track threats across alternative online sites. Earlier in his career, he actually served as an intel officer with the US Army and then as an analyst with the US Department of Defense, where he served in Iraq and was assigned to train the Iraqi National Intelligence Cell. So Welton has pretty much seen it all when it comes to identifying threats online. He was a senior researcher at the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory, where he developed technical solutions to address disinformation and online propaganda. And so that's what we're going to be covering today. So let's start the show. Hi, Welton. How are you?
I'm doing great, Rafi. It's really nice to be here. Thanks for having me on.
I'm glad you're able to join us, and I'm really excited about the topic that we're going to be discussing because I have a lot of questions. The first thing that we normally do with every guest that comes on is to ask them what their first ever social media platform was.
It's going to be a little bit cringy of an answer, but my first social media account was on Facebook.
On Facebook. And are you still active on Facebook? Or what did you use it for, and what do you use it for now?
Yeah, I was one of those original college.edu Facebook folks, and I used it quite a bit for years, but I no longer have an account because of my current work and due to privacy concerns. But, it was a place where a lot of conversations happened for a long time.
But really early user as part of your college account as well. That was probably before it even went outside of the US. Fantastic, great. So I'm really interested, excited to deep dive into the topic that we're going to be discussing, and it's something you spend a lot of your time around is tracking the different types of platforms, the new platforms, the platforms that may have kind of been in existence for a little while, but actually kind of sit on the fringes of that. What are you seeing kind of today?
I mean, the biggest, most popular topic right now, the new hotness is Bluesky. Everyone's trying to get an invite onto the platform. Bluesky is billing itself as a Twitter alternative where mainstream conversations will take place. But this is a trend that we've seen emerging pretty much since 2016. Say the many of the sites that are now more popular got their start as a result of sites like Facebook and Twitter taking moderation and enforcement actions against specific accounts and users on their platform. And a lot of that fallout came as a result of the interference in the 2016 election by the Russian Internet Research Agency and others. And so that reaction spurred entrepreneurs to take it upon themselves to build new platforms, to build new places where people would congregate and have different online conversations. And so that's what we focus on. Yeah.
So Bluesky is the latest one. What's different about this one compared to the others?
I mean, it bills itself as being decentralized, as being one of the features. It has, I think, this model right now where it's starting to attract bigger name current Twitter users and moving them over. But we've seen this playbook before with other Twitter clones. Truth Social is essentially a Twitter clone. Mastodon, which is a open source software, decentralized server-based platform as well. And then there are other clones of sites. Gab is essentially a Facebook clone. And then there's a panoply of sites that are more forum-like. The original 4chan, and then the spin-offs, now what's called 8kun. Those are other places where these conversations are taking place.
And you referred to it earlier, but are we seeing innovation in this space where there are new platforms that may look similar, but actually the underlying technology is different? Or are we seeing kind of disgruntled, unhappy, breakaways that still remain small, but are basically trying to replicate the other platforms?
I think we're seeing some innovation. You're starting to see some sites integrate cryptocurrency as a part of their business model. But primarily, the sites function essentially the same as the, say one-to-many broadcast, right? Essentially, that's the Twitter model, or the update model, account update model, which is the Facebook model. And those are kind of paradigms that I think most social media platforms aren't even trying to break out of. They're trying to serve a different audience with their policies, with their stated goals, with their marketing. And that's how they're attracting folks away from the big three platforms.
Amazing. And is the kind of, you track the conversations that are taking place there. Are the conversations different? Is it a completely different group of people?
Yeah, I mean, the way that we look at what's going on, I kind of draw an analogy to when, and I'm sure you're familiar with this, when we had three television channels in the US, ABC, CBS, and NBC. And you got news, sports, sitcoms, it all happen on one mainstream site, right? And that's the equivalent of your Facebook, your Twitter, and your YouTube, where a lot of different conversations are happening in the same place. And with the explosion of alternative sites, it's really the equivalent of when we moved from those three centralized places to the satellite cable television revolution, where if you wanted to watch, I don't know, Steve Irwin Crocodile Hunter reruns on repeat forever, you could do that. There was a channel just for that, right? And essentially we've got online sites where, hey, I only want to follow news about, I don't know, anti-vaccine conspiracy theories. I can just go to that one Telegram channel and that's all I'm going to ingest all day long. And so the kinds of people who are talking in those spaces, I think it's essentially a fragmentation, fracturing of the online conversation. It's kind of, I think one of the ways that we talk about is the great scattering, to use a Frank Herbert Dune term.
The great scattering, that's amazing. I love the analogy. But if we look at the broadcasting side, many people refer to this, what we're living now, and the kind of many numerous choices that we have, as the golden age of television, because there are so many options. Would you, or I'm not sure, you would necessarily apply that same description to social media? If all I want to watch is episodes of Sharks, then fantastic, I've got that option, and that's fine. But if all I want to do is talk about criminal activity or disinformation or vaccine disinformation, there's a home for me now. Is that the golden age, or how should we perceive this current situation that we're in?
Yeah, I mean, the golden age idea is a little bit of mythos, I think. I mean, if we look back at what was being broadcast on those three channels, it wasn't serving many different parts of the population, right? And now, with so many more places where content is being distributed, there's a lot more opportunity to produce programming that speaks to other audiences. And I think in a similar way, you get that kind of phenomenon on these alternative sites as well. One key difference is essentially moderation, right? Where an editorial capability. So if a major site decides, hey, we're not going to host QAnon, for example, then the users on that site will no longer see that content, right? In a similar way, where a CBS producer may say, you know what, we're just not going to produce that show. We're not going to show that information. Mm-hmm. Many of the sites that we look at and try to help our clients make sense of, those are places that are essentially unmoderated, and they build themselves that way. They're the free speech platform. They're the anything goes platform, which is again also a little bit of a mythos in itself as well, because one thing you don't typically see on those sites even is CSAM, for example, child sexual abuse material, right? Like even
Mm.
those sites have some moderation going on, but they are much more lax with other types of content that the mainstream sites are going to deplatform.
Interesting. And so, as a average consumer, I think of my parents are on a couple of social media platforms. When each new platform is opening up, is that something that they should run to be part of? Should we be on as many of these platforms as possible? I don't necessarily mean as someone who works in the industry and you're tasked with tracking all these conversations, but as an average social media consumer, is it something we should be setting up accounts for?
I don't know. I mean, I think that that's a personal choice. And if there's something on those sites that appeals to you, you should go and be on there. It's interesting because there are other places where these discussions are happening now, like Discord as an example. Roblox has its own universe. There's more kind of internal in-app conversations happening as well, where there's kind of audience capture for, I don't know, chat on Fortnite, for example, right? Like it's almost like social media where you have that communications capability.
Yeah.
Although it's a little bit more ephemeral. But I think the average user, should just weigh the cost benefits of being on those sites. And I think also you should take into account, personal privacy, for example, where your data is going. A lot of the new sites don't have a lot of restrictions on how they use your data. And so
Mm.
some of their business models revolve around selling your data. Again, in the U.S., we have very, very poor privacy laws. We don't have a lot of, with the exception of a few states, we just don't have a lot of restrictions on how that data is being used. And so you should be careful about how those sites are set up and to preserve your online privacy. Yeah.
Fascinating. Do you think most people come to those sites presuming that there are the same terms and conditions, terms of service, and also possibly the same levels of moderation that they were used to with some of the bigger platforms?
I, I think it's hard to say, but I would just guess most people aren't reading terms of service. It comes up on your screen. There's this wall of text, and you just go, okay, scroll,
Click, click.
scroll,
Yeah.
accept, right? And that's the big kind of catch-all, right? And but problematic from the perspective of users who, there's a asymmetry in how much time and effort a user can spend doing that versus the coterie of lawyers that a site has to draw up those terms of service and force you to accept them to be on their platform, right? So.
Mm, yeah. And how do the larger platforms, the more established platforms, how did they perceive these smaller entrants, either the newer entrants that have come even in the last few months or other sites where people are congregating?
Yeah, I mean, I think probably the meta sites don't really consider these smaller places to be competitors in any
Hmm.
real way. I was surprised to see there was some discussion around Twitter either delinking or making it harder to move people over to Substack and to places where Twitter was perceiving to be competitors. I mean, that's one of the, I think, problematic issues with having centralized control, right? Like, and these sites have gotten, have said, hey, we don't exercise editorial control, but in fact,
Mm.
in practical purposes, they can do that, and they do that on occasion. And so there's, I think, a kind of, you know, it's really hard to say how the bigger sites are, looking at the smaller sites in terms of their business models. But certainly they're aware that these sites exist, right? And there's kind of we call cross-platform pollination happening, where an idea will emerge on a smaller platform like Telegram, although Telegram's not that small anymore, and it will make its way into a mainstream platform like Twitter or Facebook, and then start to gain traction there as it gains more of an audience share.
That's fascinating, and I would love to hear more about that because I think it's a really good segue into the next question that I was going to ask about how those that are tasked with tracking threats whether it's in the private or the public sector, how should they be looking and how should they be interacting and listening to these platforms?
Yeah, I mean, for one thing, there's just a lot of data out there, right? And it's really, apt that your podcast is called TMI, right? TMDI, I guess. Um, and you know, there without the use of artificial intelligence to help you sift through that content, it becomes really hard, right? You have only so many hours in a day to be able to sift through and make sense of the content that you're seeing and to follow leads and to really identify the true threats that are there, right? Is this person serious about causing somebody harm, or are they just shit posting, right? And so the deeper investigation that's involved there, I think many people, if you're doing it completely manually, you're behind the eight ball, right? You really do need technology to help you get that assist. Now, technology can't do everything, right? It's not good enough to do that, but it can give you that edge and be a force multiplier or make you more efficient in your research.
Mm. And so, tell me about what your team is doing. How you tracking threats, and how you doing that on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, I mean, we're a SaaS company, so we're building software to help our clients make those assessments to track conversations that are happening. And so we've built a data science pipeline that essentially um, looks at narratives that are popping up in these spaces, track specific users, and it helps the our clients deep dive into specific topics that are concerning to them. And we also extract and identify, highly violent language, highly hateful language, and those types of concerning content that might indicate that there's an issue emerging with a specific
Mm.
topic.
And we spoke about moderation, but are you likely to see more harmful, hateful, misleading misinformation on smaller and alternative sites compared to the larger ones?
I would have said an absolute yes prior to the emergence of the Musk acquisition of Twitter. Um, I think Twitter's new moderation policies have changed this a little bit in that you're more likely, there's been some reporting from the Center for Countering Digital Hate and others that indicates that there has been an increase in anti-Semitic and other kinds of noxious content on Twitter. And so, while this is a commonplace occurrence in the places that we look at, for example, incels, right? It's a forum where people congregate to talk, basically have highly misogynistic conversations. That's the primary purpose of the site, right? They got banned
Mm.
from Reddit for doing that. There's still concerning conversations happening across the internet, including on Facebook, right? They struggle. I think the platform does still struggle with the private conversations that are happening inside of private groups because of the way that they've now set up the encryption on their site.
So that's really interesting, and I would kind of take you back to a point you made about how some ideas are fermenting, and conversations and communities are forming around specific ideas, maybe on other sites, but then they're gravitating and they're pollinating across other platforms. Um, I'd love to hear more about that. Are there any examples you can point to?
Yeah, I mean the entire how QAnon emerged, starting gaining traction on 4chan, Akun, migrating over to Reddit for a while, getting kicked off of Reddit, and absorbing a lot of the anti-vax conversation as well. Um, you know, that kind of crossover, the movement of communities as they get banned from one place and move to another. Like that's a fairly commonplace occurrence for those more, I would say, kind of like sticky uh, core group of users who are moving that way. Another would be the Donald, which again started on Reddit, then moved to essentially its own community site, and then expanded, right? It went from the Donald.win to now communities.win. That's a whole, group of folks who, move from one place to another. So yeah, I would say, this is something that is of concern. It should be a concern for the larger sites, right? Where there may be and again, I want to reiterate this too. When we talk about what the conversations that are happening, there's perfectly legitimate conversations happening across the internet, right? And by perfectly legitimate, I mean First Amendment protected. Criticize the government. There's lots of things that you can say that are okay. But even the First Amendment has its limits, right? There have been recognized limits. The Brandenburg, doctrine is the one that's pointed to. You can't scream fire in a crowded theater, right? Incitements to violence, right? Those sorts of things are not okay. And the problem with when you allow that kind of speech to happen on broadcast sites is a lot of people see it, right? It's not the equivalent of standing on your street corner with a sandwich clapboard that says the world is going to end. Right? That person can only reach the people on the street corner. Mm-hmm. You can now reach millions of people with your messages. And the organized activity that takes place afterwards leads to things that we saw with January 6th, the Trucker Convoy, kinds of activities that we see that are, essentially anti-democratic in many ways.
Mm-hmm. And around any given topic, what does that organization look like? I think we have conversations all the time about the interactions between real and fake accounts, or between different communities or community leaders and then other groups of people. What does that mean when you say organizing?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. All it takes is one account to surface an idea, and then perhaps a few people glom onto that. Could be real, could be impersonation, it could be other kinds of accounts that exist, and then that starts to get some traction on a specific place, and then you see a spike in activity, everybody talking about a specific idea. Mm-hmm. Right. One recent phenomenon that we point to is the conversations around drag story hour in the United States, right? That wasn't something that was really being talked about, like, I don't know, a year and a half ago, mm-hmm. and has become this very a topic around which we see a lot of violent rhetoric. And again, it just takes one or two kind of entrepreneurial idea influencers, essentially, to push an idea, and then other people will jump on it. There's a little bit of confirmation bias going on in that those accounts that are following on are, hey, I agree with that. Yeah, let's push that idea to the top, and then now it's a mainstream topic of discussion. So I think it's interesting. There's certainly crossover in communities that are talking about specific topics. There are topics that I think would naturally find a natural home in specific communities. We don't do a lot right now with fake accounts, bots, and that sort of thing. But certainly, there's been lots of evidence that those types of manipulative activities have occurred in the past, and have been used by state actors, non-state actors, to cause chaos online.
So it's been amazing. You talk through the different types of platforms, the behaviors, the trends that we're seeing. I want to talk now a little bit about, if you are tasked with identifying the threats, from all types of spheres, public and private, what are the types of threats that you're seeing from these kinds of platforms?
Yeah, I mean, there's everything from the very direct death threats against specific public individuals, sometimes less than public, kind of limited spotlight celebrities, people who just maybe said something and then went viral, and all of a sudden they're getting a lot of attention. We see doxing happening on these sites. That's another phenomenon that, again, is of real concern across the community in terms of keeping people safe. And then there are, I think, concerning types of content, whether it be hateful, for example, anti-Semitic content, that I think in the aggregate makes it more likely that there's going to be violence committed against a specific community, because it makes people, it dehumanizes that community to another group, and then maybe one or two or a group of folks within that community take it upon themselves to take action, right? And you see that sort of thing happening as well. And then there are the long festering, it's harder to measure the influence. Here's an example: anti-vax content. And the extent to which that content led to, say, and I think the U.S. adoption of vaccines for the coronavirus was the basically least amount across the OECD or something like that, right? What was the impact of anti-vax content on that? It's hard to say for certain, right? You'd have to go back and do some real hardcore scientific studies to figure that out. But likely didn't have zero impact. And so the indirect harms that come about as a result of, steeping yourself in that content, deciding not to get the vaccine, contracting COVID, and then dying from it, right? That's also kind of real harms that are coming from these virtual spaces. So we talk a lot about the nexus effect, what happens when the virtual crosses into the physical, when things that are just on the internet, just bits and bytes, have a real world impact. And that convergence of these two realms, I think, is where the rubber really meets the road in terms of having to get a pulse on what's going on and being ahead of the curve and understanding those emerging trends.
And is that something that you've seen physical examples of?
Well, yeah. I mean, you saw that virtual organizing for January 6th, for example, right? A lot of that discussion then led to people congregating outside the ellipse and then making their way to the Capitol building, right? People talking about going to Ottawa with the Trucker Convoy and then going there 2 weeks later. That same group, or a franchise of the group, decided that they wanted to try to disrupt the Super Bowl in the U.S. that same year, and then did a convoy from California to Washington, D.C., and we're circling, 495 here. So, yeah, I think that there's, and to the extent that virtual is the place to organize, there's legitimate uses for that. And then there are uses where, it's going to cause real world harm and get people hurt.
It's interesting when these big events happen in the real world, these big protests, these big activities, and you have one group of people or commentators on it saying, this has come completely by surprise. No one could have predicted anything like this. But then you often have other voices, those who are listening hard enough to say, actually, here's the evidence. The conversations were taking place on social media. You just had to know where to look and look in the right places and take them seriously enough. So I think that is something that, unfortunately, is something that we're seeing. There are probably now quite a few examples, of which you've mentioned them now, of that actually occurring.
Yeah, and look, there are definitely true anomalies out there, things that just emerge out of nowhere. There's no indicators, there's no signatures that something's going to happen. But what's the phrase? The future's already here, it's just not evenly distributed, right? I think that's part of the problem, is that the knowledge of what's going on in some of these spaces, just not everybody knows that it's happening, right? And again, it's difficult because of the volume of content that we're talking about to be able to look everywhere at once. You have to have systems in place to help you do that. And even then, it's not always possible to be aware of everything, right? So.
I have tons more questions, but unfortunately, we could go on for hours and hours, but I'm not sure everyone would love that. So we're going to try and put in the show notes links to some of the things that you've referred to, but also links for further reading, because I think this is such an interesting, evolving, fast-paced topic of conversation. And so, actually, hopefully we can have you on at a later date to tell us more about what's happening in the trends. But we do have to finish on, if you could give us one example of something good, one example of something bad, and then one example of something fake you're seeing in the online world today.
Yeah, I would say something good. The online communities and the ability to find new music online. SoundCloud, Spotify, just amazing how much music we have access to now. I'm probably listening to something new every day. It's great, and just that's something that didn't, wasn't around, right? Just 5, 10 years ago, just didn't have that ability. I mean, I guess Napster was the first to try to distribute music that way. Bad. A lot of these forums that are dedicated to misogyny, places where I think people with really fringe views can congregate and wallow in their self-misery. I don't think that's super healthy. And I wish there was some way to engage with those audiences, populations, to get them the help that they need. But that's something that, again, the online world, the interfaces, it gives people the ability to connect to those other folks who have those fringe views, right? So that's the kind of dual-edged sword of being able to connect. So, fake. Yeah, I was really impressed by some of this new music that's come out where, it was like Drake and The Weeknd, doing a collab that wasn't real. Yeah, just I listened to that track and I thought this is a brave new world that we're living in.
So that for people
To,
that for people that don't know, that's the song that was released, but actually by Drake and The Weeknd, but actually was created using generative AI, right?
yeah, it was generative AI, and you could have fooled me. It sounded like Drake.
It was a good song. I listened to it. Thought it was a great song. I think it's been taken down from a lot of places. Welton, Dr. Chang, as I know you do not like to be referred to, you prefer Welton, but either of those, thank you so much for coming on the show. This was really fascinating. I'm really glad you were able to walk us through it. I think it's an area where a lot of the conversation is often dominated by the big platforms. And so I'm glad that we were able to have kind of an opportunity to talk through and learn more about some of those other platforms and new platforms as well. So really appreciate it. Thanks for taking the time out of your busy schedule. And have a great day.
Thank you, Rafi. It was great being on.
Take
Appreciate
care.
it.
Bye.